I hope everyone can see my main screen okay. Perfect. All right. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here to being at the first Science Art Summit. My name is Sonhita, and today I'm going to take you on a little personal journey on how I got into science illustration and also talk to you a little bit about some of my favorite recent projects. But first, before I do that, I'd like to briefly introduce myself as a scientist. So if you were to look at the education section of my academic CV, it would look something like this. I completed my education in Canada and a postdoc in Sweden, and I was absolutely taken by plants and plant biology. So I dabbled in various aspects of the field, from evolutionary ecology, sustainable agriculture, to finally settling in on molecular biology. But in addition to being a scientist, I'm also a science communicator. I love reading and writing about science over a hot cup of coffee. And if you follow the arrows over here, you can see the progression of my science writing and academic editing experience after my PhD. My first job after graduation was as a scientific editor for various Elsevier journals. And then from there, I worked as a scientific editor for Molecular Cell, a cell press journal. And this was actually the first cover that I made ever. And now I write short articles for the Plant Cell, and I also use the editorial experience that I've gained to help authors who want to publish their works at various journals by being an editor for the organization called Life Science Editors. But what I want to focus the rest of this talk on is my experiences as a science artist. I just launched my company this past fall, but I've been making science illustrations for about 2 to 3 years now. And I get this question a lot, and you may ask yourself, how did I get here? So let's travel back to the early 90s when little Sunita over here was making her first masterpieces under the underside of her parents' dining table. And in fact, my happiest memories as a child were when I was making art. I was known to be the art teacher's pet, and I won many art prizes, and a family trip to Disney World convinced me that I was going to become an illustrator and an animator. And my parents humored me up until a point about in high school when it was time to pick a career. And then they wanted me to become a medical doctor. And I didn't want to disappoint them. And I was also scared of this image of a starving artist. And thankfully, I loved biology. So I dropped art and I focused on getting straight A's in science with the long-term goals of becoming a doctor. But then during my university years, I fell in love with plant biology and I totally abandoned medicine. So I guess I became a doctor, but just not the type that my parents wanted me to be. And my university years were very academic, and making art was a luxury and not something I did often enough or consistently. But whenever I did it, it really filled me with joy. And then fast forward to 2020, we were all in the throes of COVID, and I was nearing the end of my PhD and I couldn't go to the lab. So I tried to use my time as best as I could. I was reading and writing about for my dissertation, and then something interesting happened. In my downtime, I found myself painting biological scenes. And I showed one of these paintings to a very good friend of mine who worked as a course administrator at the university. And she suggested that we put the image on the cover of the lab manual for an undergraduate course. And so here's a picture of me looking very pleased with my first actual science art that was published and featured on the lab manual. So this piece was a recognition for me and a turning point in how I viewed my art and I approached it. And then let's go now to late 2021. I bought an iPad and that was a total game changer. I taught myself how to use Procreate on the iPad and made illustrations for myself and experimented. I also received really great advice on how to approach digital illustrations from my art mentor at Cell Press, who was the senior illustrator at the time. Is there a line over there? Interesting. Uh,
Yeah, that was me by accident. I'm gonna delete it, but just go on. Sorry.
Sounds good, no worries. So then at Molecular Cell, one of the tasks of the editors is to pick covers for each issue. And after going through this exercise a few times, I mustered up the courage to ask my boss, the editor-in-chief of Molecular Cell, if I could make the cover. And in fact, there was a special issue that we were working on at the time. And with only 2 days to go, I appreciated that he humored me and my request. And then because that gave me the opportunity to make my first cover, which is right here, back in for a special issue on mitochondria in 2022. And that cover got me noticed by my other colleagues and journals at Cell Press. And soon I was getting requests to make many other covers. And this became a great professional development opportunity for me within the company as I got to network with other editors and also learn what the different journals were publishing. And since people often ask me about my process and how I make these covers, I'd like to now share three of my favorite and recent projects and how I work through them. So for the first project, this came to me during my postdoc. I was commissioned by an editor and an old colleague who really loved my art. He asked me to create three covers that, which when placed side by side, would create one seamless image. And when I got the email, I was ecstatic because this also meant that this would be my first and potentially only cover for the journal Cell. So I was given a lot of freedom, and I was told that the journals wanted to cover certain topics that they would be publishing. So how I then approached it is that I would be in my first few drafts, I was focusing on placing the different elements that were being published by the different journals. Sometimes some of the concepts were being overlapped in metabolism in the various parts of the image, and then I started creating my artworks. And I wanted the different elements to be very visually recognizable, like the heart, the liver, the mitochondria, the salad bowl, and cancer cell, and so on. But also, I wanted them to be in harmony with other elements in the image. And this process only improved with more back and forth with the editors of the journal, which was very helpful till we finally had a version that we all loved. And this version was then cropped subsequently to create individual covers. And these covers from last year, I would say, is one of my best works to date. And I'd consider my magnum opus for now. But this was all done with nothing but my iPad and a desire to make science behind these journal issues on metabolism feel fun and approachable while also creating a theme of celebration since last year was also Cell's 50th anniversary. And now for my second project, I want to talk about a cover I did where also last year, I was commissioned to make a special issue for Molecular Cells focus on RNA biology. And this was a lot of fun because I got to work with my old colleagues and also familiar topics again. So the individual pieces and ideas just flowed out of me. I wanted to create a film noir theme for this one. And you can probably tell from all the last pieces I've shown you that all the artwork I had shown you till now, I love using colors and I use them abundantly. And that's my way of expressing myself. But for this one, I wanted to create a serious film noir detective theme with a more limited color palette. And that isn't something that came naturally to me. So even in my intermediate drafts, you can see that there was a lot of color and it was not helping me create that mood. So after receiving a lot of good advice and severely restricting myself in terms of the color, I created this final image, which was still colorful, you could say, but not as unrestrained as my artworks had been until now in terms of color. So this cover was monumental for me in my science illustration journey as it taught me about how to use and not use colors to tell a story in a meaningful way. And then for my last example, I want to show you this proposed cover art that I made for a study on how SARS-CoV-2 affects bronchiolar epithelial cells and immune responses in patients with different underlying respiratory conditions, such as cystic fibrosis. So this client in particular, he wanted me to incorporate as many scientific elements and data from the paper as I could. And I appreciated that request because it was a nice challenge for me. So I studied, what ciliated bronchiolar epithelial cells look like and what SARS-CoV-2 looked like in various illustration forms. And after many reference pictures, I created the SARS-CoV-2 virus and the epithelial cells, and I adapted them in a style that was still unique to me. And then I also incorporated actual transcriptomic data from the paper, and I superimposed that onto the bronchioli over here that you can see. And I also took inspiration from published volcano plots, and I used that to highlight the divergent responses between different patient groups. So my science art doesn't just end with cover art. I'm also constantly applying for opportunities that let me bring science illustration to the public space. For instance, last year I designed the 150th anniversary t-shirt for the Royal Canadian Academy of Science. I added elements from old Canadian journals and publications in here, like microscopic organisms that were collected and published in the early 1900s in different Canadian publications to make it especially Canadian. I also create digital collages to explore science fiction scenarios, and this is a really satisfying process for me because I get to seamlessly, meld in different pictures together to create a cohesive narrative and story from scratch. And lastly, I had my first solo art exhibition at a library that's in the neighborhood that I grew up in, just steps from the high school where I went to and where I graduated from. And I hung my art pieces in the top row over here. And along with them, on the bottom row, I also hung different explanations that I wrote in very simple language about each art piece, explaining the scientific concepts and motivation behind the art. It was important for me to do this so that the members of my old community could see what was actually happening and understand the art a bit more and maybe even be inspired by it. I even left a notebook for people to leave comments, and I received some really touching comments like this one. This is one of my favorites. It says, this is very beautiful, and I wish I could have learned something like this in my biology classes." So this goes to show just how much we need more art about science in public spaces so we can break down whatever barriers exist currently between scientists and non-scientists. I will leave you with some parting words since I get a lot of questions about how to get started in science illustration, especially from young career researchers. So I would start by telling you, just keep making art. You don't need to overthink it. Just focus on becoming a better artist every day. And you're a constant work in progress. And that's the same very much for me too. Even though I've been doing it for 3 years, I'm just getting started. I recommend picking one software and maybe a few brushes and getting to work and creating without thinking about the outcome. I think it's also very important to share your artwork online and tell people what you do. This helps you get noticed and overcome self-doubt. And you never know who's actually going to notice your work and hire you in the future, because this was the case for me. I used to publish all my works on Instagram, and some research groups followed me there, and that's how they hired me. I think you can also seek opportunities around you, especially if you're starting out. It's not easy to get clients right off the bat. So this is a good time to ask your colleagues and friends if you could make art for them. Maybe they can pay you a little bit or take you out for a nice dinner at the very least, while you get to also build up on your portfolio in the same time. I think having a nice website and a portfolio also goes a long way. I only got my first website this past October, so it's just been 6 months. And it's been very different, I feel like, because people now take me more seriously and view me as a professional compared to before. So I think it's worth having a very simple landing page. You don't have to pay for it, even like a cheap WordPress website would do, but it will make you feel good about how you're approaching your science art. And also the field is growing. There's so many active communities in science, art, and illustration these days. You can find them on LinkedIn, Discord, Instagram. This is a good way to connect with your peers who are going through the same things as you and maybe asking the same questions, and also finding mentors and more senior researchers who have gone through what you're already going through, so you can ask them for help and their perspectives. And lastly, if you don't have any work, make art that you want to make and you want on your profile to be hired for, because that is ultimately the dream. And the most important part of this line of work, so that you don't burn out, is to create art for yourself first and foremost. So thank you all for listening to my story about how I got into science illustration, and thank you to Philip for organizing this amazing summit, which gives the six of us an opportunity to tell you our stories and answer your questions. And next, it's my pleasure to introduce Matteo. He's an incredible science comic artist and neuroscientist who I've been following for many years, and it's an absolute honor to share the stage with him today. He'll be discussing his work as a scientific multimedia producer and why comics are the ideal form of science communication.
Wow, thank you.